Mr. President, I rise in strong opposition to the fast-track bill that the Finance Committee approved last night that will be on the floor, I think, here next week or the following week on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The most important aspect, I think, of this debate is that what we are discussing with the TPP is not a new concept. It's not like somebody came up and said, I got a great idea, let's try this trade agreement, and it's going to be really good for the American worker and the American middle class and the American people. The truth of the matter is that we have seen this movie time and time and time again. And let me tell you that the ending of this movie is not very good. It's a pretty bad ending. And I think most Americans understand that our past trade agreements have failed American workers and have led to the loss of millions of decent-paying jobs. And what I simply don't understand, if we were going forward in the first place, new idea, maybe give it a shot. But when we went forward with NAFTA, went forward with CAFTA, went forward with permanent normal trade relations, and we heard all of these folks telling us how great these agreements were going to be, and it turned out that virtually everything that they said was inaccurate, not true. Why in God's name would we go forward with another trade agreement, which is in fact larger than previous trade agreements? And let me just give you an example of what I mean, Mr. President. On September 19, 1993, President Bill Clinton said the following, quote, I believe that NAFTA will create 200,000 American jobs in the first 2 years of its effect. I believe that NAFTA will create 1 million jobs in the first 5 years of its impact, end of quote. President Clinton was pushing the NAFTA agreement very, very hard, and that's what he said. In 1993, same year, the Heritage Foundation, one of the most conservative think tanks in the country. So here you have a liberal president, Bill Clinton, you have a conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation. This is what they said. Virtually all economists agree that NAFTA will produce a net increase of U.S. jobs over the next decade. In 1993, the distinguished senator from Kentucky, who is now our majority leader, Mitch McConnell, this is what he said, and I quote, American firms will not move to Mexico just for lower wages. Mitch McConnell. American firms will not move to Mexico just for lower wages. Well, was President Clinton right? Was the Heritage Foundation right? Was Senator McConnell right? No. I think the evidence is pretty clear that they were all wrong. According to the well-respected economists at the Economic Policy Institute, and their facts are usually hold up pretty well, NAFTA has led to the loss of more than 680,000 American jobs, 680,000 American jobs. What President Clinton said was wrong. What the Heritage Foundation said was wrong. We lost substantial numbers of jobs. In 1993, the year before NAFTA was implemented, the United States had a trade surplus with Mexico of more than $1.6 billion. Last year, the trade deficit with Mexico was $53 billion. We had a trade surplus of $1.6 billion. Last year, we had a deficit of $53 billion. Now, how is that a success? I don't quite know. In other words, Mr. President, NAFTA has been a disaster for American workers. What about the Chinese trade agreement? I remember hearing all of the discussions about how great it would be if we had a trade agreement with a huge country like China. Think about all of the American products that they would be buying, manufactured here in the United States. Here is what President Clinton again. President Bill Clinton said about PNTR with China back in 1999. And it's important to remember what people said because they're saying the same thing about this trade agreement. But this is back in 1999, Bill Clinton, President, PNTR with China. Quote, in opening the economy of China, the agreement will create unprecedented opportunities for American farmers, workers, and companies to compete successfully in China's market. This is a 100-0 deal for America when it comes to the economic consequences, end of quote. Once again, that's a liberal president Now you have the conservative think tanks who love unfettered free trade. In 1999, discussing PNTR with China, the conservative economists at the Cato Institute, these are really conservative guys, this is what they said, quote, "The silliest argument against PNTR is that Chinese imports would overwhelm U.S. industry. In fact, American workers are far more productive than their Chinese counterparts. PNTR would create far more export opportunities for America than the Chinese." Well, what can we say about that? Cato Institute wrote in 1999, quote, "The silliest argument against PNTR is that Chinese imports would overwhelm U.S. industry." Yeah, right. So you go out to any department store in America and you buy products. Where are those products made? Guess what? They're made in China. It appears that, in fact, Chinese imports did overwhelm U.S. industry. Cato Institute was dead wrong. Mr. President, again, nobody is really surprised with that. There's no more debate about this. Permanent normal trade relations with China, that trade agreement was a disaster. The Economic Policy Institute has estimated that that trade agreement with China has led to the loss of 2.7 million American jobs. The trade deficit with China has increased from $83 billion in 2001 to $342 billion in 2014. Now, in terms of China, I don't know that the American people have any doubt about it. Every time we go shopping, the products overwhelmingly made in China. People look at their own towns and their own states. My state, loss of more and more manufacturing jobs. Since 2001, we have lost 60,000 manufacturing facilities in America. Not all of it is attributable to trade. There are other reasons, but a lot of it is attributable to trade. Millions of decent-paying jobs gone. People thrown out on the street as companies move to China, Vietnam, and other low-wage countries. There's not a debate about it. That is exactly what has happened. Corporation after corporation has said, why do I want to pay an American worker $15, $20 an hour? Why do I want to deal with a union? Why do I have to obey environmental regulations? I can move to China, I can move to Vietnam, I can move to Malaysia, I can move to Mexico, I can pay people pennies an hour, bring the product back into the United States. That is what they said, that is what they have done. Major corporation after major corporation has reduced employment in America at the same time as they have increased employment in other countries. And not only is it the loss of jobs, it is the race to the bottom. It is employers saying to workers, look, I'm cutting your health care, I'm not giving you a raise, and if you don't like it, I'm moving to China. Because we got people all over the world who are prepared to work for wages a lot lower than you are receiving. You take it or leave it. And that is one of the reasons why today the typical American worker is working longer hours for lower wages than he or she used to, and why wages have gone down in America. That's what the global economy has done. That is what these horrendous, unfettered free trade agreements have pushed on American workers. That's the Chinese trade agreement. An estimated 2.7 million American jobs lost. Then you got the Korean free trade agreement, which has led to a loss of some 60,000 jobs. Our trade deficit with that country has gone up from $16.6 billion in 2012 to $25 billion in 2014. So you have a history here of failed trade agreement after failed trade agreement after failed trade agreement, and people say, hey, we failed, let's do the same thing again, and this time we're really, really, really going to succeed. I don't think anybody believes that. And I do understand that Wall Street loves this trade agreement. You know, they are staying up nights worrying about ordinary Americans. And I understand that the major corporations in this country, all of them, love this agreement. And the drug companies love this agreement, which should give you enough reason to hold this agreement in doubt. Now, Mr. President, the administration, the Obama administration says, well, trust us. Forget about the other trade agreements. This TPP is something different. It's a better agreement. This time it'll be different. This time it'll support about 650,000 American jobs. Well, supporters of unfettered free trade were wrong about NAFTA, they were wrong about CAFTA, they were wrong about PNTR with China, they were wrong about the Korean Free Trade Agreement, and surprise of all surprises, they are wrong again. Mr. President, if the fast track is approved, it would pave the way for the passage of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. And as you know, this trade agreement is poised to be the largest free trade agreement in history, encompassing 12 nations that account for roughly 40% of the global economy. This is a very, very big deal. Let me just talk about two of those countries who are involved in the TPP, and that is Vietnam and Malaysia. Mr. President, we are fighting here, and I understand there are differences of opinion. We are fighting here in the United States Congress to raise the minimum wage. I happen to believe that a $7.25 minimum wage, which is what it is federally, is a starvation wage. I would like to see it go over a period of years up to $15 an hour. You may disagree. There are others who disagree. But let me tell you what the minimum wage is in Vietnam. The minimum wage in Vietnam is 56 cents an hour. 56 cents an hour. So you have American workers being forced to compete against people who make 56 cents an hour. And we have a situation, just as one example of many, where the Nike company, a company which produces over 365 million pairs of athletic shoes each year, goes all over the world, 365 million pairs of athletic shoes. Do you know how many of those athletic shoes are manufactured in the United States of America? 50 million, 20 million, 10 million, 1 million, zero. On the other hand, they employ 330,000 workers in Vietnam, mostly young women, and while they refuse to give us the detailed information, our supposition is that most of those women make very, very low wages. And let's be clear about what is going on. According to a November 11, 2014 article in the Vietnamese newspaper Thanh Nien News, that's the name of the newspaper, this is what it says, quote, "Analysts acknowledge that Vietnam's abundance of cheap labor has played an increasingly pivotal role in wooing foreign firms looking to set up overseas manufacturing operations in a country with a population of 90 million, end of quote. In other words, that's what it's all about. Wages are very, very low in Vietnam, and companies from the United States and all over the world will go to that country. And allowing the TPP to be passed will make it easier for multinational companies to shut down in America and move to Vietnam, and that is wrong. And when we talk about free trade, it's important to understand what is involved. Who are we competing against? Are we competing against Canadian workers whose standard of living is as high or higher than ours? Are we competing against workers in Germany whose standard of living may well be higher than ours? No. You're competing against people who are struggling to stay alive, earning the lowest possible wages that keep a human being alive. Last year, the Human Rights Watch published a report on Vietnam, and here are some of the quotes from that report. Quote, "The human rights situation in Vietnam deteriorated significantly in 2013, worsening a trend evident for several years. The year was marked by a severe and intensifying crackdown on critics, including long prison terms for many peaceful activists whose quote-unquote crime was calling for political change." In other words, in Vietnam, if you speak up, you want political change, there is a likelihood you will end up in jail. Vietnam bans all political parties, labor unions, and human rights organizations independent of the government. Another quote, "The authorities require official approval for public gatherings and refuse to grant permission for meetings, marches, or protests they deem politically or otherwise acceptable." Not my point here to beat up on Vietnam. They are a struggling country. They are a poor country who went through a terrible, terrible war with the United States that caused them incredible harm. But when we look at a trade agreement, when we say to American workers, this is your competition, people who are making 56 cents an hour in some cases, people who can't form an independent trade union, people who politically can't stand up and speak out for their rights, is that really appropriate and fair to the American worker? I don't think it is. I don't think it is. Let me say a word not just on Vietnam, but another country in that consortium of partners in the TPP, and that is the country of Malaysia. And, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to submit to the congressional record a New York Times article of September 17, 2014.
Without objection.
Mr. President, what the New York Times article talks about is that today there are nearly 200 electronics factories in Malaysia where high-tech products from Apple, Dell, Intel, Motorola, and Texas Instruments are manufactured and brought back into the United States. Turns out that Malaysia is a major center for the manufacturing of electronics, and some of the largest electronics manufacturers in the world are centered or have plants in Malaysia. If the TPP is approved, that number will go up substantially. Now, what is wrong with that? Well, let's talk about what is going on in Malaysia, where American companies in this country and American workers will have to compete as part of the TPP. Well, it turns out that many of the workers at the electronics plants in Malaysia are immigrants to that country and are forced to work there under subhuman working conditions. According to Verite, which conducted a 2-year investigation into labor abuses in Malaysia, which was commissioned by the U.S. Department of Labor. This report was commissioned by the U.S. Department of Labor, and this is what this report tells us. 32% of the electronic industries, nearly 200,000 migrant workers in Malaysia were employed in forced situations because their passports had been taken away or because they were straining to pay back illegally high recruitment fees. According to the New York Times article commenting on the study, 92% of the migrant workers in Malaysia's electronics industry had paid recruitment fees, and that 92% of that group had paid fees that exceeded legal or industry standards defined as more than 1 month's wages. 94% of the migrants did not have their passports when Verite's investigators interviewed them. Let me repeat that. The passports were taken away from 94% of the people that these investigators interviewed. Now, if you are a migrant in a foreign country and your passport is taken away, you have no rights at all. You can't leave. You may not be able to travel. You have no rights at all. In other words, many of these workers who wanted to leave Malaysia were unable to do so. They were forced to stay and continue to work under these subhuman conditions. Mr. President, 30% of foreign workers, this is again the report from Verite, commissioned by the U.S. Department of Labor. 30% of foreign workers said they slept in a room with more than 8 people. And 43% there was no place where they could safely store their belongings. Well, Mr. President, when we talk about competition and a competitive global economy, I do not believe that the American worker should be forced to compete against workers who are literally held in slave-like conditions, unable to leave the country, having their passports taken away, working for pennies an hour. So let me conclude simply by saying this. This trade agreement is being pushed on the Congress by the largest corporations in the United States of America. They love unfettered free trade because it enables them to shut down in America and move to low-wage countries where they can employ workers at pennies an hour. This trade agreement is pushed on us by Wall Street, who wants to make sure that around the world they will have financial regulations that make it easier for them to do what they do rather than to serve the economies of countries around the world. This legislation is strongly supported by the pharmaceutical industry, who will have the opportunity to prevent poor countries around the world from moving to generic drugs and make medicine affordable to the poor people in these countries. So we got all of the billionaire class, all of the powerful corporate world supporting this trade agreement. And who's opposing this trade agreement? Well, virtually every trade union in America whose job it is to stand up for American workers, they're in opposition. I was just at a rally with them the other day. They are united. They are in opposition. You have many environmental groups who understand that this is a bad agreement. You have medical groups who understand this is a bad agreement for poor people in developing countries. And you have millions of workers in this country who do not want to compete. They're not afraid of competition. We are a productive country. They do not want to compete against people making 56 cents an hour or against forced labor in Malaysia. That's where we are today. Where we are today is, do we go forward with a failed trade policy, or do we take a deep breath and say enough is enough? Let us rethink trade policy. Let us figure out a way that we can grow the American economy, create decent jobs in the United States, and, by the way, help poor people around the world. All of us want to see wages go up in poor countries around the world. But that does not mean that wages have got to go down in the United States of America. So we need a trade agreement that works for our people, works for poor people around the world, but just is not a trade agreement that only works for the big money interests in the United States. So I hope very much, Mr. President, that the Senate will take a real hard look at this trade agreement, take a hard look at what people have been saying for years about previous trade agreements, and say, we're not going down this failed path anymore. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.